Hello and welcome to Politics Unpacked, the series where we explain one of the biggest news topics of the day, then debate the issue with a TLDR team. So it's been a while, from the US election to the end of the Brexit transition period and the ever-developing news around the pandemic, we've sadly just not had enough time to record a podcast. But we do now. Over the past few weeks and months, comparisons after comparison has been made between governance now and governance during the Second World War. The question being whether such a comparison is justified and whether we do need to look back to see how the government should react, and even whether government is and should be being held to account. This is Politics Unpacked. Times of national crises invariably mean that the executive, i.e. the government, gets more power to act quicker. No one wants people to have to deal with bureaucracy and protracted debates when everybody's broadly on the same page about the action that needs to be taken. The issue being when they're not. Throughout the pandemic, there has been marked disagreement on a lot of things, from the half-term firebreak lockdown that never was, to free school meals, to the duration of each lockdown. In any normal times, these disagreements would be thrashed out in Commons debates. Both the government's own backbench MPs as well as opposition MPs would voice their opinion and subsequently vote accordingly, in turn ensuring that policy is, seemingly, in the best interests of the country. When a government proposed policy is seen to be bad, changes can be made or it can be voted down altogether. Government accountability at its finest. The issue being that this just isn't happening. Back in March of 2020, the government pushed through the Coronavirus Act of 2020 in just 4 sitting days. The overarching thing it did was give emergency powers to public bodies and the government. And when we say emergency powers, we mean a lot of them. From the power to indemnify health workers to test, isolate, and detain a potentially infectious person. The Coronavirus Act and the Public Health Act of 1984 have together allowed for regulations to come into effect before any vote in Parliament, leading to actual calls for a binding vote on individual regulations. After backlash, MPs were given the chance to vote on individual regulations, which would lapse after 28 days if MPs didn't approve them. But even then, calling such a vote binding refers simply to what it says on paper. Realistically, voting after the implementation of measures to revoke them would lead to immense government backlash and utterly destroy credibility, as well as the fact that there's not really anything stopping the government just bringing back the same regulations again and again, other than a vote of no confidence. So in this episode of Politics Unpacked, we'll take a look at just how government has worked during the coronavirus pandemic and why the Coronavirus Act has led to calls for more accountability. So we're back doing the podcast, Nelson.
Yeah,
there's been a hiatus.
Yeah, it's been a little while, a few months.
It has.
Probably.
There's a lot's happened. We're in another lockdown.
Yeah.
Third lockdown 3. Which yeah, I mean, we're getting through it, and it's been so long that we're so far into this lockdown that the easing's already been announced.
Yeah.
Which is so it's been a while, but we're back. So we thought a good topic to sort of discuss today would be looking at sort of representation and the government's handling of the pandemic in relation to that. This whole discussion kind of stems from a Slack discussion we had yesterday, Nelson, doesn't it? Which was, I was doing some work and I sort of came across maybe some might call it a kind of an out there idea that I wish I'd have thought of about a year ago when the pandemic first started. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into
that. What I think is probably worth first discussing is maybe just a bit of background on the Coronavirus Act and how governance has changed generally since the beginning of the pandemic, because it's something that I think we maybe don't discuss enough. We discuss a lot about the impacts that the pandemic is having on individual social lives, mental health, and absolutely right, it's absolutely right. Definitely. We have these discussions, physical health, and how lockdowns are impacting people, all very important discussions. But one thing we don't really talk about too much is how the nature of democracy's changed over the last year. So do you want to have maybe a sort of summary of what do you think? Do you think it's changed a whole lot? Do you think it's fine that it's only temporary? Do you think we're going to go back to, like how do you see the state of democracy?
Yeah, so in my view, democracy has changed fundamentally because we've obviously gone from a position of passing laws through the House of Commons to a state of emergency powers because things are developing rapidly, the science is changing, so it's imperative that government responds to it. The only issue being the way they've done it. Instead of using established mechanisms, they've passed the Coronavirus Act, which more or less brings power first and foremost to the ministers, and only then afterwards are they then accountable to Parliament, rather than the other way around. It used to be that first accountability, then action. Now it's action and accountability. So that's causing issues with the backbenchers of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. So we have the Coronavirus Recovery Group, I believe it's called, the new incarnation of the ERG, which is basically just going, no, we want to vote on the measures before they come into place, which I believe led to a significant change in the Act a few weeks ago, or a few months ago.
I think it's worth noting as well that wasn't even the case originally. When the Coronavirus Act passed, and for a good few months following it, there was no retroactive voting on any of the policies brought in. The executive, the government, made a decision. And that was the decision, and it was seen that because of the extraordinary times we're in, that quick decisions should be made, and that's a valid argument. That's a valid argument that we're in extraordinary times. Decisions have to be made quickly. The government are elected at the end of the day. They're elected by the people. Each of them has a mandate. They technically are able to do that. Although a few months later they did decide that the legislature, Parliament, should be able to have a retroactive vote, and that is, as you quite rightly say, a fundamental change in the way that things are done, possibly seen as justified by the extraordinary times we're living in. I think it's also worth noting that, and I think people overstate this point when discussions are had about this. People overstate this point, but elections were delayed until May this year. Again, arguably justified. In fact, I would make the argument that is justified. The point that I would make here, and the thing that I wanted to get onto, is the fact that the executive has been given a lot of power in making decisions that would normally be made by the legislature. So, as Nelson said, if we implement a lockdown, a week later, Parliament votes on it.
Why did government even pass the Coronavirus Act in the first place? Because of the presence of the Civil Contingency Act. The government already had emergency powers it could use. It's just those emergency powers were subject to far greater scrutiny. Under the Civil Contingency Act, if the government passed emergency regulations and Parliament didn't vote to approve them, they'd immediately cease and expire. It'd be a binding failure of the regulations. So it's why on earth they implemented a dedicated act to get around existing emergency powers.
The thing that I would exactly, and this is the point, is that the Coronavirus Act gives the executive a lot more power than they would normally have. Traditionally, you would go through the executive can set policy directives, and they can decide on policies that they want to implement. Now, traditionally, executives will have quite a large majority, which means they'll be able to get them through Parliament. Now, it's it's relevant in the sense that that's practically how things work, but the actual principle of it is that Parliament will have a vote, and the reason is Parliament has the vote is because each member of Parliament represents a constituency. I feel like we're going down into basics here, but I do think this is important to understand, that each MP represents a constituency, therefore each person is represented in Parliament in order to decide on legislation. If you don't like how your MP voted, you can boot them out at the next election. What's happened in the last year is that the executive has been given a lot of power, and they're able to, they're able to pass laws. Not pass laws, but they can enact change that would usually go through Parliament and be voted on by each MP. So only the members of government make that decision, and even an even smaller group than that, which is traditionally, it's usually the cabinet, which is an even more select group, will make those decisions, and it will not go through Parliament. Now, the change that has been made is that obviously MPs can vote on it after. So the principle of of representative democracy, I do feel a little bit has been undermined. Now, this is the point that I was getting onto with the Slack conversation I had with Nelson yesterday. Now, I wanted to have this discussion today to sort of flesh out whether this would be a reasonable thing for the government to have done, because I'm honestly not convinced. So I just thought I might as well have a conversation with Nelson, and why not record it and put it on a podcast? We haven't done one for a while. I think hopefully it's going to be a fairly interesting discussion.
Yeah.
In the 1940s, and even before that, I think in the 1930s, with the Ramsay MacDonald government, the largest party, the Conservatives, formed a national government with Labour, which meant, and it was under the same similar sort of principles, which is that we're in extenuating circumstances, World War, and decisions need to be made quickly. So instead of having to go through Parliament, the executive, the government, will make big decisions to do with the war. It was thought at the time, I think the Conservatives had a majority at the time, but they thought, out of principle, we'll put politics to one side and we'll form a national government with Labour. So ministerial positions were held by both Labour, the Conservatives, and I think possibly even the Liberals at the time, but I stand to be corrected. Now, I was having this discussion, and I had a thought yesterday, what would the implications have been of doing this last year? Now, the Conservatives didn't have to do this. There's nothing actually saying they had to do this. What they've done, by all accounts, has been done legitimately. They're a democratically elected government. You can make the argument, like I possibly just made then, that it could undermine elements of representative democracy, but then again, we are in extenuating circumstances. You can make valid arguments either way. But, Labour aren't represented in the in the decisions the executive are making at the minute. And possibly a way to get around that would be through a national government, in the sense that Labour would hold ministerial positions and be able to work with the government. An advantage of that is that you set aside party politics. So there would, Keir Starmer would be working with Boris Johnson. They'd be presenting a unified front. Every person in the country, their representative, would be in some way, by virtue of their party leader being at the table, be being represented in the decisions being made by the government. Something that is not currently happening. Currently, only those that voted for the Conservatives or have Conservative MPs are being represented in decisions being made by the executive. And even if they vote those rules down, there's no guarantees that they will actually be redacted. So politically speaking, Nelson, what would the implications have been if that was implemented last year? What do you think that would have benefited one party over the other? Obviously, the obvious thing to note here is that the Conservatives didn't have to do this, and they would be relinquishing power, something that governments are quite reticent to do.
So there are political arguments on both sides, as you say. So presenting that unified front could have driven home the message of, okay, this is a crisis, we need to work together, let's put aside politics. But the thing that comes back to me is the issue of accountability and blame in the other way, in that say a national government was instituted.
Yes.
Who do we then blame for failures in vaccinations, in test and tracing, in lockdown too early or too late? It's where do we draw that line? Because the last time a national government was even on the cards was during the height of the Brexit debacle, where Corbyn was invited by May to the table, and Corbyn turned it down, arguably because he knew that blame would be attributed to him as well. So I'm seeing this as just a compartmentalizing of blame, so that.
But was that if I could be wrong here, but the invite was not to form a national government with May, it was to have a seat at the table. Two different things, two very different things. Does it, because Corbyn would not have been given a ministerial position, which is a hallmark of a national government, is that two main parties hold ministerial positions.
But in my view, it was a national government in all but name, in that Corbyn was given this opportunity to have a lasting impact on one of the biggest decisions that government ever faced, because arguably the May premiership was basically just a Brexit premiership.
But
so
the thing, and I raised this with you yesterday as well, but obviously people watching this won't have seen the conversation we had yesterday. The thing there is that the Brexit campaign, the main difference is that the Brexit campaign was inherently political, in the sense that it was called by the Conservative Party. It was a debate about the constitutional makeup of the United Kingdom, whether it's bound to European Union laws and part of a international organisation or not. It was inherently political. The coronavirus, the coronavirus pandemic shouldn't be political. The decisions made by government and they've tried to make it seem as least political as possible. They've tried to make it as bipartisan as possible. Starmer's, tried to step aside. He's tried to say that we're going to do what was the phrase he used? Constructive criticism, something along those lines.
He continued to pledge to support the government where it was the right thing to do. He wasn't just going to oppose for opposition's sake.
Yeah, so he's sort of trying to demonstrate that this is a bipartisan approach, that lockdowns are bipartisan. He's voted, even when Conservative backbenchers haven't, for lockdowns. He's trying to present this as a we're trying to use science to defeat the pandemic. These aren't political decisions. And if they aren't political decisions, and these are supposedly following the science, which it should be, and I believe that it is, why aren't both parties represented at the table? Why have the executive got the power that the legislature would normally have, without a lot of the population being represented? It shouldn't. This isn't political like the Brexit debate was. So just to sort of caveat the discussion about Corbyn and being invited to the table and the assignment of blame. It's different. It's different. It's a national emergency, and more voices at the table can only be a good thing. And as I say, that there is precedent for this, admittedly. And people keep liking to draw these. This is the thing. People love to draw these comparisons to World War II at the minute. People love to compare the pandemic to World War II, and people are criticised for doing it, admittedly. But the point is that this is something that is threatening national health, national security, the health of the nation, and if it's not dealt with, a lot of people could die. So there is precedent for this, is my point, and I find it strange that there's not been a discussion of this in the last year. And I did a quick search yesterday, and there's not been much discussed about it. I'm just trying to figure out why. I understand what you're saying. I understand the point of assigning blame afterwards, but I think that the more pressing matter would be make sure everybody's represented at the table. Do you think that was... And the other point is that perhaps this wasn't discussed because of the changing of the Labour leader last year. Yeah. So do you think that might have played a role in why this discussion wasn't had? That when the Coronavirus Act passed, it was Jeremy Corbyn in charge, and a few months later it was Starmer. So there wasn't really... Corbyn knew he was, leaving the leadership, so he wouldn't push for that, and then Starmer had... joined, when the pandemic had already started. So there's not really much of much for him to argue for at that situation. The decision not to form one had already been made. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, so I'd argue that because Starmer wasn't at the table at the very beginning, he couldn't sort of even propose that idea going forward. But I'd also argue that the reason we're not seeing a national government is just a quirk of the British political system, in that anyone who's read a politics university textbook will know that the UK is a majoritarian democracy, in that power is inherently concentrated. It's not like Belgium, or Belgium and the Netherlands, where power is dispersed in consensus democracies. It's not filtered out, it's concentrated in. So one would argue, yes, it might feel good, it might look good in that, yes, we're displaying this united front against the pandemic, but from a practical, logistical point of view, bringing more people to the table might actually slow down decision making and might create issues there instead. Yeah, no, that's an absolutely reasonable point.
More people at the table would, and especially when you have such differing opinions. But then again, those differences are between Starmer and Johnson are inherently political. They're they don't differ that much on their approach to the pandemic. I mean, look, Starmer's sometimes pushed for things to happen slightly ahead of schedule that Johnson wanted. So the November lockdown, Starmer wanted that to happen more quickly over the half term. Was it a half term? It was sometime when schools were off.
The fire break one.
The fire break lockdown, Starmer wanted that to happen slightly earlier. But inherently, they both wanted a second lockdown then. Inherently, their position on the pandemic has been the same. So there may be some differences, but they're not so fundamental that they would cause a breakdown of the pandemic response if they were working together. I understand that the main sticking point, I do agree with you, the main sticking point here is the how you assign blame and how you assign blame following the pandemic. You know, if it's a failure, but it feels like that shouldn't be too much of a concern. The concern should be making the right decisions by the British people. It shouldn't be worrying about if it, you know, how do we tell someone off if they've done it wrong. Like, that should be a problem in, you know, once this is done. The primary focus is making the right decisions by the British people, making sure people are represented, and making sure that the government are making the proper decisions. Look, the approach of representative government is that you have a government who makes decisions, you have an opposition who will hold them to account on that, so that the best decisions can be made by the British people. The government, anybody in charge, cannot make the perfect decisions all the time. It's good to have somebody to oppose that, to make the best laws, to make the best decisions possible. That's the fundamental of democracy. If you take that power and, you know, suspend this sort of separation of powers and take the legislative power from the legislature and give it to the executive, you suspend that sort of correctional nature of politics. The fact that you have an opposition party holding the government to account, making sure that their decisions are correct. If you're going to take the power from the legislature to the executive, you should also take the scrutiny that comes with it, the scrutinising element, the opposition party scrutinising the decisions of government. That's been suspended, is the point. And I would argue that that is more important than being able to assign blame in the future. I agree that being able to assign blame is important, especially around election times, but I would argue that's secondary to making the right decisions, especially when you're in a pandemic.
Well, so arguably isn't the issue then the fact that power has been transferred to the executive without scrutiny, not the fact that the executive hasn't been expanded. So we're debating the issue of, okay, accepting the Coronavirus Act, should the government have expanded Labour? Well, the primary issue is the Coronavirus Act and the avenues for accountability and opposition there.
Are you saying that is my criticism not more that the Coronavirus Act passed rather than it was passed without the Labour being incorporated into government? Is that what you're saying?
No. So the way your argument I'm interpreting is, okay, we're in a national emergency, accepting the powers of the Coronavirus Act. Should Labour have been brought to the table? I'm arguing. Well, I'm seeing it as the Coronavirus Act gave too much power to the government. Surely there is avenues for accountability that were shut down by the government.
So it's more the argument that the legislature should still have power. Okay.
Yes,
I understand that, and I do. That's not my criticism, really, because I do understand the necessity for the executive to have to move quickly in the pandemic. So I do understand the necessity to take power from the legislature and give it to the executive. I do understand that necessity. The beautiful thing about democracy is that you have other people chiming in, that you have multiple parties arguing, debating, trying to figure out the best approach. You have people inserting amendments, you have votes on amendments, you have differing opinions on how best to tackle an issue. That you have so many different voices being heard, and that's fantastic. The disadvantage is that takes a bit longer. The legislation takes a bit longer to get through, because you have to take all these different voices into account. You have to vote on these amendments. That's fantastic. It's one of the beautiful things about democracy. The disadvantage is that it takes a bit longer. Now, when you're in a pandemic, unfortunately, the fact that it takes longer is quite a big disadvantage. So the idea is that we would speed that up a bit by giving the elected government, so they are still elected, they are still accountable, the legislative's power, or more power that they would not normally have from the legislature, to make decisions quickly. That's the thought process. So I do understand that, and I agree with that. The thing is that there still should be some accountability included. I wouldn't go as far as not taking that power from the legislature. Unfortunately, that is a necessity of the pandemic. But incorporating some element of scrutiny into the executive, such as Starmer having more of a say, such as a national government, such as Starmer having a seat at the table and being involved in these decision makings, not only means that more people are represented, but also incorporates more of the scrutiny elements of the legislature without the slowing down, or at least not much more slowing down. As we've said, they already agree largely on pandemic response, so it's not like it's going to slow it down so fundamentally that they're going to be sat for 3 days discussing whether even to lock down. It's just going to be the details of how to, and that would mean the advantage of that would be that more people are represented, and that the scrutiny element that you would normally have from the legislature is incorporated still. So I understand what you're saying. I understand that my argument could be better characterised as, why did we even take power from the legislature? But I just want to make that clear, that I do think that power should have been taken. I do understand why that's the case. It's a real sad reality that that's how that's had to happen, but it's just how things need to happen in a pandemic. The criticism I have is that there's been no transfer of scrutiny from the legislature. It's just been power, and that's the bit that I scrutinise here. Perhaps I'm being too lenient, or perhaps I'm being too sort of accepting that Starmer and Johnson will just get on and they'll agree with how to deal with the pandemic. And that just because they agree that we should lock down, that's going to make things a lot easier. Perhaps it'll slow the process down so much more, and the pandemic will be worse. But that's sort of where I'm coming from here. I think your best argument, I think the thing that you brought up that I do actually agree with, is the accountability thing, and that is quite a difficult thing because you have two of the major parties both involved in it. The next election becomes tricky. But presuming that the pandemic ends before 2024, which is when the next election's called, there would then cease to be a national government, and you can see where they differ, and you can still decide on who's elected based on that. They still have fundamental political differences of how to rule the country, just not in a pandemic. So you can still vote on them based on that, and I think that that's as I say, secondary concern to the one that I've raised. Is there anything I feel like I've spoken for ages? Have you got any sort of views on this? Sorry, I feel like I've completely dominated the conversation here.
So it's just the issue for me is the fact that we did resort to the Coronavirus Act and didn't activate the Civil Contingency Act or bring in something like Steve Baker has proposed, the Public Health Act, where it's yes, we transfer powers to the executive, but that power still is scrutinised by the legislature. It doesn't. We don't need to give them the powers and then just hold back and do nothing. It shouldn't have taken parliamentary pressure for Parliament to have the ability to vote on lockdowns and measures and other tactics done by government. It should have been, okay, government's going to take this power away from you temporarily, but now and again we'll go, okay, are we doing the right thing? Let's have a debate when we're not in critical times. Because the entire point of a lockdown is we lock down because it's coming to a critical juncture in the virus. But surely either in the days before lockdown comes into place or the immediate days afterwards, why wasn't there a discussion as to, okay, we've entered a lockdown, let's talk about the exit path, how we support schools, free school meals. Why wasn't that debate and discussion during the calmer times? There are periods of time where we can step back as an entire parliament and go, okay, this is right, this is wrong, let's fix this. So my issue is the fact that we gave the executive too much power through the Coronavirus Act, because in hindsight, there are tons of people on the Conservative side and Labour side going, we didn't read into the Coronavirus Act and what it gave government. We didn't see the amount of power being transferred whilst we should have pressed for the Civil Contingencies Act.
It was phenomenally quick how the Coronavirus Act itself is hundreds of pages long and details a large amount. And I remember at the time, Steve Baker, the head of the Coronavirus Research Group and formerly the European, what was it, the ERG, the European Research Group, the Coronavirus Recovery Group, sorry.
Yeah.
He said at the time that every time he flicks through, it's objectionable power after objectionable power, but unfortunately it's necessary to give it over. And there wasn't time to debate the bill itself because they just had to get it through. And again, it's this sort of like necessity. I get the necessity. I truly do get the necessity of the executive having more power to be able to deal. And maybe this is in contrast to you, who thinks that there's more like, you know, quiet times where you can debate these things and yeah.
No, so the arguing. So I agree. You'd be hard pressed to find someone who didn't agree that the executive needed more power to react quickly. It's just that power shouldn't have come with a complete disconnection of scrutiny. It shouldn't have come with the fact that, oh, a minister will pass secondary legislation as and when they so wish, without a recourse for Parliament to scrutinise it after the fact. I understand that we need to move quickly, but scrutiny after the fact is still possible. Yes, there might not be time to, before implementing a lockdown, sitting down and going, okay, is this the right thing to do? But immediately after implementing, surely you can just set up a Zoom call and start debating it.
This is possibly where me and you differ here, is that I don't think that after the fact scrutiny is good enough in a pandemic, because it opens the avenue for a certain policy to be implemented, a certain lockdown or something, and then it be voted down in the days to come. So you've shut down a number of businesses, you've shut down for them to be opened again 3 days later because the legislation, you know, is voted down in the Commons. That eventuality is so costly for businesses, and it's so detrimental to public faith, even in the governing nature during the pandemic. Like I just, that eventuality is so, it would be so detrimental not only to businesses but to public trust in the government that I just don't see that as a viable option. Which is why this sort of like, oh, we'll implement a lockdown, then let Parliament vote on it a few days later. That's a great option. It's like, that's great provided they say yes. If they say no, that's a terrible option. Now, I'm not advocating for Parliament to vote no to a lockdown. Lockdowns are essential. They're required. They are necessary to stop this, you know, pandemic, you know, spreading and killing even more people. They're absolutely necessary. So I wouldn't advocate for them to vote down. But while we're discussing the actual political nature and how politics works in the pandemic, if that is ever voted down, if they implement, even if it's not a lockdown, if it's some reopening package or something like that, and Parliament votes no after the fact, you know, that's a horrific situation that we'd be in. So I'd rather there be some representation of opposition parties during, you know, in government, so that the decisions being made are representative of everybody in the UK, as I you know, said earlier.
But does that representation have to be directly at the cabinet table? Can't it not be through like Privy Council, where the leaders of major parties are already members? So it's discussion of what's going to happen before the fact, implementation, and then voting after that discussion. So all the parties get together, go, okay, we need to lock down. Starmer, how long do you think? Sturgeon, how long do you think? Well, Sturgeon's devolved, so let's not get into that. So there's nothing stopping discussion beforehand, implementation, then voting, but formalising that in bringing Starmer and Labour Party into government would maybe complicate things too much. In that, if government had discussed major issues, they would have got Starmer completely on board, and we would have seen Starmer come out politically to support it. It's because we've seen Starmer be more political than most opposition leaders, in that he is actually using his right to a television slot immediately after the Prime Minister's done a statement. So if Starmer had been brought, if Starmer had seen the science, seen the data, just like, yes, we can bring him in, but it doesn't mean that we need to bring him in.
I understand your point. It's the formal. You take issue with them formalising Starmer's power being at the cabinet table. Why couldn't it be done informally before?
Yeah.
Have discussions between party leaders. But the point I'm making here is the principle. Like, look, this whole discussion is the principle of democracy. Like the actual fundamentals are something completely separate. The fundamentals of it are that the politics of Johnson giving power to Labour he wouldn't like, and presumably Starmer wants to be able to, say after the pandemic, this is what Johnson did. We'd have done it this way. Therefore, we would have done a better job. Vote for us, sort of thing. Like the actual like day-to-day politics of it is something completely different. I'm talking here about the fundamentals of representative democracy and what would be best for representative democracy. Now, I admit that them forming a national government would be unlikely to happen for the reasons I've just stated. Like, it would be unlikely. What I'm saying is that would be the right thing to do from a representative democratic standpoint. And the point is that it has to be formalised power. Otherwise, they don't have any say. Like, it's just them going to Johnson saying, maybe we should lock down a week later, which he's already done. Johnson saying, nah. And then that being it. Like, that's what happened in November. That's exactly what happened in November. Starmer had no formalised power. He suggested we lock down slightly earlier. Johnson said no. Starmer tries to humiliate him at Prime Minister's questions. It's not... What I'm saying is it should be formalised power for the nature of representative democracy to be sort of respected.
But so surely your argument stands as well during normal times. Surely you're just arguing for consensus democracies.
I'm not, because in normal times, legislative power wouldn't be transferred to the executive. The whole criticism I have of this is the fact that legislative power, the government has more power than normal. The standard system, the standard Westminster system works. Like you can have, you can argue whether one's, but whether consensus democracies are better or worse. There's members on the team who live in countries that have consensus democracies. I've written scripts with them. Yeah. I've had conversations with them myself about the advantages and disadvantages of such systems. And whether you like them or not, you can make pros and cons for both representative and consensus democracies.
Yeah.
But my point is that representative democracies do work, and I'm fine with them. The issue that I have at the minute is more to do with the power that's been transferred from the legislature to the executive. These arguments wouldn't hold in normal times because you have avenues for scrutiny. You have avenues for people to vote down legislation. At the minute, my issue is more to do with the fact that they don't have any tangible way to vote down that legislation. If you have a seat at the table, you can set directives, you can have charge of ministries. There are tangible power that both parties would have, which means that they both would have an actual power and a say in the rules. At the minute, they don't. Only the government has the say in the rules. Anybody that's represented by a Labour MP, a Liberal Democrat MP, anybody else doesn't have any tangible way of stopping the government doing whatever they want, and whether it's unlocking at a certain time or locking down at a certain time. The government does that. They could vote it down a few days later. The government could turn around and say no. It's just there's no avenue for actual representative democracy at the minute. So that's more my qualm.
The thing is, I'd still argue that with the majority the Conservatives have, they're always going to have executive dominance in that due to the party system, due to the whipping system. It's always going to be Conservatives will be represented in the executive, and the interests of Labour MPs and Labour represented constituencies just won't be represented.
Technically, yes. However, firstly, they still do have power through committees, through urgent questions, through everything else, and they have the ability. Parliament, irrespective of maybe I put too much emphasis on actual opposition parties, but MPs themselves, irrespective of what party, can vote legislation down. Like if the ERG, not the ERG, I'm years behind here. Sorry. If the Coronavirus Recovery Group, the CRG, you know, what wanted to if you know, if they sided with Labour and voted the rules down at the minute, nothing would actually happen. Like, the government can say no to that. And that's more my criticism, is that the legislature as a whole, irrespective of party, doesn't have any power. If you were to incorporate all parties into a national government, you would have the legislature, the scrutiny of the legislature would transfer over with the transfer of power. It's not so much individual parties that I'm advocating for here. It's the principle that the legislature gets to decide on the rules, and they get to decide on how certain laws pass, and they can vote things down. At the minute, if they vote something down, the government turn around and say no. Like, yes, you're right that there is executive dominance in this country. That's the way the representative nature of the government works. But even if you have the biggest majority ever, if you have a backbench rebellion that side with the opposition parties, you can have legislation voted down. That can't happen at the minute. If Labour and the CRG decide that they want to lock down later and want to vote the government down, they can do that after the fact, and then the Tories can say no, and the government can say no. So
they could just make the vote. They could just make it the vote a vote of no confidence. So you vote this down,
fine.
The government's gone.
You're right. That is still a thing that they could do. That would be absolutely horrendous from a political standpoint in the pandemic, if we're talking about there being effective government. But you're absolutely right that the only way for the legislature to actually reclaim power, before the Coronavirus Act expires, would be either to take power from them or through a mechanism like that, and that's not a good system. That's not a good system.
Yeah, we can agree on that.
I think we're probably coming to an end of the discussion here, but I feel like ultimately we have slightly different criticisms here. Yours is more that power was even taken from the legislature to start with. Mine is that only power was taken, and that the scrutiny element should. And to be completely honest, as much as I like discussing national government, it's quite an interesting thing. I do think that there could be other ways of incorporating scrutiny into the executive. There doesn't necessarily have to be like an actual national government, but in some way to incorporate that legislative scrutiny from the legislature to the executive in that power transfer. That would have been nice to see, and that's more my point here. Your point seems more to be the legislature could still have power. There's no necessity for the executive to transfer the amount of powers that they did.
No, it was transferring it without having the avenue for scrutiny. And on that, we're on the same page. It's the executive should take power in an emergency, but there must be an avenue for the legislators and MPs as a whole to hold the government accountable for the use of that power. That is what's missing.
That we agree on, and that is a good place to end. So first podcast in a while. I feel like it's an interesting topic, but I would genuinely, and I mean this genuinely, if anybody has any opinions on this, anybody has any views on what we've said, please let us know in the comments, because this is one of the discussions that I am actually interested in knowing what people think. Maybe what I'm saying is completely, like Alice in Wonderland. It's completely, crazy, not going to happen. It's a fantasy. Tell me. I want to know. I'm genuinely interested in what your thoughts are about national government and the legislature playing more of a role in pandemic politics. So let us know what you think in the comments. So thank you for watching nonetheless though.